Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and in my quest to ruin beloved childhood franchises, I realized I've been missing a big one. Pixar, and what better starting off point for making monstrous sculptures than a couple of actual monsters. I figured these guys would be a great pool to dip my creepy little toes into because they are immediately recognizable, beloved, and simple in design. For instance, Mike is basically just a sphere. And as an admittedly pretty lazy sculptor, that's a design choice that I can get behind. Of course, he's got a few other things that make him him, like his great big single eyeball and his adorable oversized mouth. And I mean his limbs, of course, but we'll get to those later. For now though, I've hollowed out the bottom side of his head body so I can reposition his mouth hole more towards the bottom. I figured he kinda scoots along the floor, eating up anything that's been unlucky enough to fall to the ground, kinda like a creepy Roomba. I've built out his lips with a bit of extra clay that I can then add some cracks and fissures into by cutting into it with the soft edge of my clay shapers before jamming just a whole slew of creepy little Roomba teeth into. I always like to see what other people have envisioned when it comes to making creepy characters, and it was kind of funny that just about every creepy Mike Wazowski on the Google seems to have some variation of a big hole surrounded by teeth. I'm not sure why it's the go-to, but it just feels right, you know? Otherwise, that's pretty much it for his head and body finish, so once I've added a bit of random gnarly texturing, I can get ready to pit him on some spikes. These spikes, of course, will be his legs, but before I sort those out, I want to give him an initial bake in the oven before adding his little pair of horns. Then I can pull him off his little wooden stand, bend the legs into a more appropriately creepy Roomba position, then mount him on a larger block and drill some holes for his arms. Finally, once I've settled on a pose, I can start adding clay to the limbs. Now, I like Mike's little skinny limbs, but I wanted to make them a bit more conducive to the scuttling that I picture him doing when he moves around, so I've made them extra long this time. Otherwise, it's business as usual here with a pair of beautiful tri-toed feet ending in a set of well-manicured claws. I'll build up his arms with the same sort of pseudo-humanoid musculature as his legs and then get to work making his dainty little hands. As with all things, these start out as little balls of clay that get cut and pulled and twisted until they're adequately creepy and long, then they're finally ready to be stuck in place. Now with Mike all but finished, the only thing left to do is add a little bit of skin texture, which I'll do using one of my favorite tools, a nitrile glove. I'll often use these gloves to add a little bit of simple texture to skin since they've got a very fine grippy surface that leaves terrific little indentations on the clay. Otherwise, Mike is finished and it's time to get to work on Sullivan. Unfortunately, as was very much the theme in this week's video, I didn't plan very well ahead. Because I started with Mike first, it meant that in order for Sully to be somewhat to scale, he was going to have to be pretty big, which means I needed to make his armature adequately strong. Thus, I had to make the ultimate triple wound wire skeleton, and then wrap it in several pounds of aluminium foil. Otherwise, once I've got my metal body built up, it's just a case of covering all the exposed aluminium with a thin layer of clay. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with Sully to make him as spooky as Mike since he's a big lovable ball of fur, but I figured I could just get started and see where it ended up. Originally I was thinking something along the lines of like a werebear or a minotaur, but even painted blue, neither of those really seemed like Sully. I was getting kind of frustrated and disheartened when it suddenly occurred to me, holy sh*, what famous furry flat-faced double-horned man-eating monster is the spooky, albeit albino, equivalent of Sully? The Wampa that tried to eat Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. Look at him, he's perfect. Throw a little blue paint on him and he's basically Sully. Which means I now have an end goal in mind and I can get to work making my Sully the best Sully that he can be. To that end, at this point I've given Sully a face that is an accidentally horrifying amalgamation of Sully and Shrek, which I can then add some wrinkles and scream lines to before adding a small amount of fur to his face. Now I'm only covering his face since I've got a perfect foolproof plan for the rest of his body that will in no way go wrong and make me want to give up entirely. Otherwise his head is finished, so I can add some teeth. And I can gussy up his gums a little bit before giving him a tongue. With the tongue in place, the face finished, and a general idea of what I want Sulley to look like now, I can get to work detailing the rest of the body. At this point, I know his body is going to be covered in fur, so I don't need to worry over much about his musculature, but his feet will be mostly exposed, so I want to make sure that his toe game is on point, and once they're looking good enough, I can throw them in the oven for a quick bake before getting to work on the rest of his limbs. Once I've drilled my holes and jammed some wire in place, I'll bulk out the armature with some more aluminium before covering it all with clay. Same as the body, I'm not too worried about the detail here since it's all going to be covered in fur anyways. On the other hand, Sulley's hands aren't furry, but they pretty much follow the same process as Mike's, just less dainty and more sausagey. Unlike Mike though, Sulley gets some custom fit fingernails rather than those long creepy finger points. Finally, to finalize his final form, I'll add a set of dorsal spikes along the top of his tail, and then it's time to paint. Now, because I'm going to be painting Sulley blue and Mike green, I don't really need to worry about priming since acrylic paint adheres well to this clay. That being said, I got caught up in the moment and primed them anyways. I suppose it's not really a bad habit to get into, and it will make painting the mouths and at least one of the eyes a fair bit easier. Speaking of painting mouths, that's what I'm going to start with, and since Mike is 38% mouth, it makes sense to start with him. Now, as I often do, I'll start by laying down a light pinkish hue, followed by a variety of shades of pinks, reds, and purples until I'm happy enough. Then I can get to work painting his body, which follows the natural progression of light green followed by darker green shading, followed by the realization that I don't like it, so I'm just going to repaint the entire thing using the airbrush. I'll make a little baby bonnet out of blue tack to help keep the paint off the rest of the body, then I'll give the eyeball a red center fade, then cut it back by working outwards with a white over top. To break up the one note of the green, I'll add some khaki to the fingertips and then blend it into the forearms, then add several layers of pink and red until it's adequately spooky before finally touching up the tips with an ominously red finish. I'll do the same thing around his mouth hole before painting all the teeth with a bone white to khaki blend, then doing the same thing for his horns but with a slightly darker tip before finally giving him a big blue iris. I'll paint his pupil with a dark gray, then give the whole eyeball a coat of UV resin. Finally, I'll give all the goopy bits of his body a once-over with a high gloss varnish to really highlight his natural sliminess, then it's on to Sulley. I'll start with the same pink to red to purple mouth painting process before giving him a full body base coat of aqua blue. Now for the astute observer out there, you may be thinking, didn't this guy say he was going to make Sulley furry? He looks awful smooth to me. Well, dear disembodied voice, don't you worry, because I've got a plan. And it involves this stuff right here. This is synthetic Sulley fur that is the perfect shade of blue, and it is the worst material that I have ever worked with. I thought it'd be fun to make Sulley's fur look real, so I picked up some bright blue fabric thinking it would be a relatively easy process of cutting tufts off and then gluing them in place until I had a perfect miniature version of Sullivan. However, as soon as I cut the fur away, it became damn near impossible for my big dumb hands to handle, and I quickly realized just how ill-prepared I was, both mentally and physically. Eventually, I gave up on the tufts and just started gluing entire strips onto Sulley like I was giving him a reverse body waxing. I used Tacky Glue to hold the fur in place, which is tacky out of the bottle, but it still takes a while to set, so I was stuck adding sections, then holding them in place until they dried enough to add the next part. Each time I added another layer of fur, I wondered if it's too late to just take it all off and add more clay, but like a first-time barber that keeps removing hair in the hopes it'll eventually look good, I just kinda kept going. Eventually though, I got to this point, which looks kind of like if Sulley was wearing a fur coat made of himself, which I guess is at least a step in the right direction. So I left it here for a few hours to let the glue dry, then went and cried in the shower so that no one could see my tears before coming back to give it all a trim. At this point, maybe there's a handsome boy hiding under all that hair and he just needs some TLC to bring him to the front. Eventually, I managed to hack that long hair back enough that I was able to crack out a beard trimmer to really start to put a dent in this furry catastrophe. Plus, the beard trimmer had the added benefit of throwing tiny motes of blue fiber into the air, ensuring that I'll be pulling little blue hairs out of my mouth for weeks to come. Finally, once the worst of it was cut back, I used the leftover clippings and a bit of spot gluing to cover up any of the obvious bald spots, as well as build up a bit of the fur on his legs and tail. Then I cut another strip to wrap around his chin like a fake Santa beard, trim that to shape, and then add some final tufts on top. Thankfully though, I bought the exact right amount of fur and I'll never have to do this again. Just kidding, I accidentally bought a lifetime supply of this devil's grass, so if you know what I should do with the rest of it, let me know in the comments down below. However, while Sulley isn't looking good, he is looking good enough, which means I can get to the final details. I'll use my airbrush to add some little purple patches before painstakingly painting all the tiny details that I really ought to have done before I started adding copious amounts of horrible blue fur. All his nails will get a coat of flat black, then I'll give his nose a darker shade of blue before giving his horns a few coats of gray. I started by painting his eyes white with blue irises, then decided to go with black, and then decided that I liked the white before finally going back to the blue. In the meantime, however, his teeth will get a brown base coat, then I'll work my way up to white tips, followed by a final high gloss varnish to give his mouth a nice slimy shine. Finally, to give him that little bit extra, I'll use a bit of stringy translucent glue between his teeth to make him look extra slobbery, then he's finished and it's on to the glamour shots. Now, as these two beauties spin in the background, let me take a minute or two to thank the absolute gems over on Patreon who continue to support this channel for reasons I don't fully understand. And a very special shout out to the newest of them, Sarah with T, Paige, Count Derpula, ASA, Taylor Template, Sean Graham, Deadeds, Mo Curry, Fake Pliskin, Tazier, Nefarious, The Daddy Sore, Shiny Shori, Jennifer Leslie, Stephen Collins, Rich N, Casey Kennedy, Too Much Good Oxygen, Julian B, Freya Craig, Purple Fox Productions, Jam, Lucarn Anderson, Marion, Dan Kripke, Hope Blighton, Ravenwing, and Katie Elliott. You are the well-used beard trimmer that keeps this blue furry mess of a channel in check. As always, if you like this video, then consider liking that smash button and don't subscribe to forgetting. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.